This is a joint work with Juan Carlos Reboredo from the University of Santiago de Compostela, a member of ECOBAS, and Andrea Ugolini, who is a professor in the University of Milano Bicocca. Before starting, I should say the usual disclaimer that these views are the one of the authors, and they do not represent necessarily the opinion and the view of the JRC. In this work, we try to capture through a model of dependence the impact of different climate transition scenarios on the financial stability of the European financial system. To begin with, I will start motivating the issue, the topic, and why this is important from the European Commission point of view. Then I will briefly and in a very plain words, I will explain the methodology in a quite visual way. Then I will shortly describe the data and the main results, and to sum up, I will summarize the main conclusions of our paper and our contribution. So regarding the motivation, I think that this work could be understood within the new action plan for financial sustainable growth. So this is an evolution of the European Union strategy to tackle with the climate change and supporting the financial stability that came out this last summer. There are four main pillars. So the first one relates to the green assets and tools to enable the sustainable transition towards a low carbon economy. So we are talking in the first pillar about green bonds and other financial assets. Then the second one concerns the inclusion of all the actors in this transition. So here we may put the focus on inequality aspects, and the fourth pillar refers to the coordination, the international coordination, in order to be able to deal with the climate change and the coordination between the different international countries and legislations to deal with this challenge. The third pillar refers to the behavior of the financial sector and how the financial sector could contribute, but also how the financial sector could be affected by the transition towards a low carbon economy. Our work is mainly filling some gaps and adding some policy-related research on this pillar. So within this third pillar, we have several goals that should be tackled by the European Commission. Within them, for instance, we have to monitor and address potential financial risks that could came from sustainable challenges. So in this aspect, in our paper, we try to answer some questions. So for instance, how financial firms could behave in a coherent narrative with the NGFS scenarios. So this is the network for the greening of the financial system. So there are several scenarios depending on how the transition is evolving. The second question would be how the financial firms could be affected by their exposure to carbon-intensive sectors and assets. Then another goal within this third pillar is to take into account climate risk in all the risk management measures. So we will try to answer some questions like how much capital would the financial firms or the banking sector would need in order to deal with different climate transition scenarios. How this capital could change depending on the scenario, or how these different transition scenarios could modify some well-known risk measures from the practitioner perspective, like the value at risk or the expected shortfall, and how this, the answer to these questions could change depending on the type of business model that the financial institution have. So probably the answer to these questions will be different depending on the type of firms that we are dealing with. So for instance, banks, insurance firms, real estates, all these firms could behave in a quite different way, as we will see soon. Then I think that this is the main challenge of the paper, because the questions are so demanding, and they are so let's say sophisticated in the sense of knowing the impact of the different transition scenarios and the impact in the financial stability. Could we answer these questions in a plain way, using a methodology that is easy to replicate and using public data, so not restricted data, so public that can be could be available for anyone, so not restricted to the regulator or the supervisor. So it could be also performed, this type of climate risk analysis, by investors, by risk managers, by investor and investment funds managers, and so on. So in order to answer these questions, first it is necessary to show you the big picture of what the NGFS scenarios mean. So according to the network for the greening of the financial system, we could find three main paths for the transition. So we have one path in which, for instance, emissions are increasing over time, so no policy measure, no incentives are created in order to decrease CO2 emissions. So this would mean that we are going to a hothouse world scenario. Then we may have another scenario in which policy measures are taken gradually, so we can decrease slowly and in a smooth way the emissions over time. So this will be coherent with we call it orderly transition scenario. And we have a third scenario in which the policy measures and the measures in order to deal with climate change are taken in an abrupt way. So we can find quite a strong correction in the trend of CO2 emissions, and this is called, according to the NGFS, a disorderly transition scenario. Each scenario would impact in the economy and in the green and brown firms, meaning the firms that are most and less exposed to climate transition scenarios, and this will finally affect to the financial system through the risk of repricing of the financial assets and asset price adjustments that could impact in the portfolio of the financial institution. So just to show a small example of what we could expect under the different scenarios. In a disorderly transition scenario, green firms, meaning those firms that are less exposed to this transition risk, they could anticipate opportunities in the transition. Then in the transition we could face also some changes in the behavior of investors. So we may expect some flight to green behavior of investors, so the price of the green firms will increase. On the other side, the brown firms could suffer some kind of reputational risk, meaning a stigmatization of the sector. They may have to face carbon tax burden also, and maybe they will find some difficulties to absorb traded assets in this new transition framework. So traded assets means those assets that the brown firms are holding that in the disorderly transition scenario will decrease its value quite drastically. On the other way around, in the hot house wall scenario, we find just the opposite. So the policy measures are taking in a lower speed than expected. So green firms will find a competitive disadvantage against carbon-intensive firms. Maybe they will find a lack of support from the government to boost the renewable energies, and on the other way around, brown firms will find that the high carbon asset that they hold are taking longer than expected to become traded assets. So the expected devaluation that they were expecting actually in the high carbon products is not materialized. So in the hot house wall scenario, we will expect a decrease in the asset value of green firms and an increase of the asset value of brown firms. The opposite way, the opposite outcome will be expected in the disorderly transition. So brown firms will experience a decrease in their asset price, and green firms will experience an increase in their asset value. So the disruption in the different business models is the result of a change in the timing and the speed of the adjustments towards a low carbon economy. So in the disorderly transition, the speed of the adjustment is faster than expected, and in the hot house wall scenario, the speed of the adjustment is lower than expected. So we are translating these different climate transition scenarios in terms of the movement in the stock portfolios that will happen within each climate scenario. So in the orderly transition, we will expect that everything will be as expected. So we are not expecting some strong market corrections in the portfolio. So in a green portfolio, which means a portfolio that is has a low exposure to climate transition risk, the brown portfolio will be that portfolio that has a high risk of transition of losing value in a disorderly transition. So in the disorderly transition, we will see that the green portfolio value surge and the brown portfolio value decreases. In the hot house wall portfolio, in the hot house wall scenario, we expect the opposite outcome. So the green portfolio will experience a sharp decrease, and the brown portfolio will experience an extreme increase in the value. So depending on the different outcome of these three portfolios that are representative of the stock market, we will adapt the systemic risk measures that has been introduced by Adrian Brunner-Meyer and Geraldine Ergun for measuring systemic risk in the financial sector. We are going to adapt these measures to climate transition scenarios. So regarding the methodology, I will try to be brief and to show in a graphical way the different scenarios and how we are building these different scenarios. So first, some backgrounds about the econometric approach. We are using a copula approach that is a methodology that allows us to decompose the joint distribution between marginal distributions and a function of dependence. We are providing some time dynamics to this dependence following specifications that has been proposed by Pathon. And the main advantage of this methodology is that it allows us to show and reflect some asymmetric behavior and time dependence that is seen in financial assets in the markets. The copula approach has some limitations as the fact that we are assuming the same type of relationship between all the variables within the copula. So we are using an extension of the copula approach that is called the Vine copula approach, in which we are using bivariate copulas in order to build a much more complex dependence structure. Regarding the marginal distribution, we are using a quite standard approach that takes into account changes in the mean, heteroscedasticity, and also potential fat tails and skewedness in the data. So I will show this example because I think that it is quite easy to understand how this mathematical framework is reflected in our main research question. Here we have a 3D plot in which we have different dots that corresponds to observation. Let's say this is built by simulation between brown returns that will be the returns from the brown portfolio, green returns that will be the returns from the green portfolio, and the financial firm returns, so one financial institution. Its dot represents an observation in which, for instance, here we have financial returns of a specific financial firm, let's say minus 2%. The returns from the brown portfolio are above 15%, and the returns from the green portfolio are above 5%. So this 3D figure can be decomposed in several pairs of scatter plots. We are showing here simply the histogram because this will be the histogram of the green portfolio, this will be the histogram of the returns from the brown portfolio, and this will be the histogram of the returns of financial firm X. In each pair of returns, we are getting the structure of dependence between, for instance, here between the brown portfolio returns and the green portfolio returns. That will be this figure. So what we are doing in a mathematical way, and then we are estimating by numerical integration, is setting some areas between these financial variables. So, for instance, in a disorderly transition, we were saying that the returns from the green portfolio will be higher than normal, so mathematically we are assuming that we are in this green area that represents all the returns above some specific quantile that we are setting in the 80th percent. And the brown portfolio, we were saying that in the disorderly transition, green portfolio, the green portfolio was increasing its value while the brown portfolio was decreasing its value. So the brown portfolio will be below a certain percentile that we are saying that the percentile is the 20th percent. So we are in this brown area. So brown portfolio are in this left side. Green portfolios, green returns are in this right side. So we are setting this scenario that is represented by this square here, right? So by the combination of these two criteria. So green portfolios, green returns are high, and brown returns are low or negative. So provided that we are in this square, in this small square here, the distribution of the returns of the financial firm will be different, because we are setting a scenario. The only way in which the distribution of the returns for this financial firm will not change will be in the case that this financial firm is independent from both portfolios. Yes, please.
How did you define green versus brown? Did you use any EU classification like currently is being applied, or how?
Okay, I will go. I will answer that question later on in the data section. Mainly, we are using indicator already employed by practitioners that is called the carbon risk exposure, that reflect the degree of exposure of a certain firm, not only financial firm, but any firm that is quote, the exposure to the climate transition risk. This measure is employed by Morningstar in order to define which investment funds are green or brown. So we are following this approach, but as a robustness check, we have employed different criteria like CO2 emissions, scope 1 and 2 combined, and the results that we get are quite similar. So, but I will be more precise about these portfolios in the data section. So in the orderly transition, we were saying that all the stock market is all the stock portfolios are in normal times. We are defining normal times, so the transition is smooth, the transition is going on as expected, so investors are not doing any investment, let's say, correction. So we define normal times as an area around the median. So we are between the 40th and 60th percentile of the green portfolio, neutral portfolio, and brown portfolio. And the results for the financial firm will be that also conditioning on the combination of these three areas, so the purple area, the green area, and the brown area, we are getting a different distribution that is reflected in these orange bars. So probably the returns are more, less, the returns of the distribution are around 0, so the volatility is much lower. Probably the fat tails of the distribution are removed, and so on. And finally, the last scenario was this hothouse wall scenario in which the transition is taking longer to be completed than expected. So investors and the market will correct. There will be a asset market adjustment. So the green portfolio will decrease its value and the brown portfolio will increase its value. So this will be reflected in the opposite scenario that we got in the disorderly transition. So if in the disorderly transition we were facing some profits in the green portfolio and some losses in the brown portfolio, we are getting now the opposite, we are setting now the opposite conditions. So the green portfolio will be below a certain quantile, and the brown portfolio will be the returns of the brown portfolio will be above a quantile that we are setting in the 80th. So we have returns that are the 20% highest according to the distribution at each time t, and the green returns will be the 20% lowest of the distribution that we have at each time. Each time t, the distribution is changing because we are adding some dynamics in mean, volatility, and dependence between variables. And conditioning to the combination of the scenarios for the green portfolio and the brown portfolio. So this small square here, we are getting a change in the financial firm distribution from the blue bars to the orange bars. So basically, and this is the same that Adrian and Brunner-Meyer or Girardi and Ergun are doing, we are moving from an unconditional distribution to a conditional distribution. But the criteria that we are setting is quite different from the criterion, because they only introduce one criterion that they are setting to measure systemic risk. So once we obtain this conditional distribution, we can compute the mean return of this conditional distribution that we are going to call the climate transition expected return. We can compute a quantile of this conditional distribution that we are calling climate transition value at risk. And we can compute the mean return below that quantile that we are calling here climate transition expected shortfall. So these are going to be measures that could be quite useful for practitioners, supervisors, and investors to take into account climate transition risk in their portfolios or in the economy or in the financial system, as we will see in the results section. Regarding the data, in order to build the green, neutral, and brown portfolio, we are using more than 900 European listed firms. In order to build the portfolios, we are using a criteria based on the carbon risk score, that is a score employed by Morningstar to measure the transition risk in fund portfolios, but we have done the exercise also with CO2 emissions, and the result holds. And regarding the European financial system, we are using more than almost 200 financial firms from countries from the European Union, and also countries outside the European Union like Switzerland or UK. We are adding these firms also because they could have quite an impact because of the connections with the European financial system. The data that we are using goes from 2013 up to December of 2020. So basically, in order to build the carbon risk score, we are at each year, because the data of the carbon risk score is provided annually. We are dividing the sample, the cross-section distribution of this more than 900 listed firms between green, neutral, and brown portfolio, depending on the percentile in which these firms, in cross-section percentile, in which these firms are located. So we are taking the 20% of the sample that has a lowest carbon risk score, so they are the less exposed firms to climate transition risk, and we are using these firms in order to build this green portfolio. We are taking the 20% of the firms in this 900 listed firms sample. In order to build the brown portfolio, we are taking the 20% of highest carbon risk score, and the rest of the portfolio is built is employed to build a neutral portfolio that will reflect the, let's say, standard dynamics of the stock market. So regarding the results, I will try to be brief. I will present first the results by sector, then I will move to present the results by countries, aggregated by countries, and then I will present some findings for the banking sector regarding capital needs and some simulation results that support the results that we have already obtained in the previous subsections. So here we are presenting the mean return under different climate transition scenarios. So the green line represents the mean return under a disorderly transition scenario. The red line represents the mean return in a hothouse wall scenario, and the blue line represents the return in an orderly transition scenario. And we are dividing the financial sector into 4 subsectors. We are seeing that the non-banking sector is either getting a almost zero impact from the disorderly transition scenario compared to the orderly transition scenario, or even getting some profits, some positive returns in the disorderly transition scenario. Whereas in the banking sector, we are getting a negative return within the disorderly transition scenario. If instead of looking to the mean return, we are looking to a quantile, in particular, we are getting here the value at risk at 90%. So we are getting the lowest 10% returns at each time, depending on the conditional distribution at each time for each subsector. We are getting that the banking sector is getting a value at risk that in absolute terms is higher within the disorderly transition than within the hothouse wall scenario, whereas the non-banking sector is getting the opposite results. So the non-banking sector is getting higher losses in the hothouse wall scenario than in the disorderly transition scenario, and also the heterogeneity in the cross-section is higher in the hothouse wall scenario than in the disorderly transition scenario. So the cross-section behavior is quite different in the hothouse wall scenario. Also the results for the expected shortfall under the different climate transition scenarios hold in the sense that are similar to the ones that we have seen in the climate transition value at risk. If we are seeing the results, in particular here we are putting the focus on the expected returns depending on the different climate transition scenarios. We have that in the disorderly transition, countries from the Southern Europe are mainly getting losses in their financial system compared to France, UK, or Northern Europe. Whereas in the hot house wall scenario, we get the opposite picture, which makes sense because the conditions in the disorderly transition and in the hot house wall scenario are just the opposite. So in the disorderly transition, we have profits in the green portfolio and losses in the brown portfolio. And in the hot house wall scenario, we got profits in the brown portfolio and losses in the green portfolio. However, there are some asymmetries and some tail dependencies that means that losses in the hot house wall scenario and profits in this scenario are much larger than the losses and profits that we could get in the disorderly transition scenario. Moving on, because I would like to end this presentation on time, we are computing the capital needs for the financial firms. So basically we are adapting the S-risk from Engel. We are adapting the estimation of the capital needs, meaning the difference between the capital that we have and the capital that we need. We are getting this approximation by taking into account the potential evolution of the capital shortfall under different transition scenarios. And this is done by extrapolating the expected returns under each climate transition scenario. We are calling it climate transition risk in this sense. We are getting the maximum of the climate transition capital shortfall and zero, meaning that we are not allowing the netting between financial firms. If we were not setting this condition, we get a negative value, meaning that it is possible to, through netting, so the losses from some financial firms could be covered by the profits of the rest of the financial institutions. I'm focusing here particularly in the banking sector because it's the most interesting one, and we are seeing in these colors the main four financial firms that are contributing to the capital needs of the banking sector. And we can see that obviously after the COVID crisis, the stock market conditions change. So we are experiencing here a peak, but it's around 140 billion of euros. That could seem a lot, but compared to estimations of systemic risk computed by Engel are 1/3 of the capital needs that we will need in case of the bankruptcy of a too big to fall bank. Moreover, the losses in the disorderly transition for the banking sector are much higher than the losses that the banking sector is getting in the hot house wall scenario. And also the losses are quite focused on some particular firms that if we see they are different depending on the scenario. So in the disorderly transition we are talking about UniCredit, about Banco Santander, so banks from Southern Europe, and in the hothouse world scenario, the main banks that will be affected by this transition that is lower and slower than expected are financial firms from France or UK, like BNP Paribas. Also, just to complete the analysis, we are doing also some simulation for the next 4 years, and we are, for the next 5 years, and we are seeing that the behavior that the expected return that the different subsectors of the financial system will have, depending on the scenario, are coherent with the previous results that we have shown in this presentation. So we are getting that the banking sector is mainly affected in the hothouse world, in the disorderly transition scenario, while the banking sector is getting profits in the hothouse world scenario, and the opposite happened in the non-financial, in the non-banking sector. To conclude, we are providing an empirical setup that is able to quantify systemic impact of the different climate transition scenarios, and we are translating these climate scenarios into systemic risk measures that are well known by the industry and by the practitioners. We are doing some forecast exercise, and we are defining these different scenarios using public data and using a quite easy to replicate methodology, which is quite an improvement with respect to other methodologies in which either they do not take into account different scenarios, or either they use some restricted data, so in order to know which is the exposure, the portfolio of each bank to the different sectors, or is quite cumbersome way of estimating the impact, because they are using some, let's say, temperature and other variables of carbon emissions that are quite difficult to introduce in economic models. The results show that banks are mainly exposed to a disorderly transition scenario, while the opposite happened in the non-banking sector. There is a large heterogeneity in the cross-section performance of the risk measures, especially for the non-banking system, and particularly in the hothouse world scenario. Southern Europe are the countries that are experiencing the highest financial losses in the disorderly transition scenario, while UK, France, and Northern Europe are obtaining the largest financial losses in the hothouse world scenario. And the capital needs are led by different firms depending on the scenario, but are, they could be managed by the financial system, especially if we compare this climate transition risk with the potential capital needs in a systemic risk event. And finally, I would like to thank you very much to all of you who have been listening to my presentation, and I'm open for comments, questions, and all your suggestions.
Bueno, vamos a hacer también, por si acaso alguien quiere preguntar en castellano, en galego, etcétera, como Javier, pues tenemos la suerte de que fala en galego tamén, ou podemos hacer más. Como decimos, abrimos para preguntas. Perdón que tivemos un problema co micro. Non sei se hai algunha pregunta, ou teño algunhas cuestións, suxerencias, preguntas, ideas, pero quero tamén, pues, por suposto, antes de nada, deixar Aos nosos asistentes teñen algunha suxerencia, idea para clarificar, etc. Alguén de aquí ten... Queres preguntar? Bueno, pois eu quería che preguntar, Javier, cando vamos á gráfica dos bancos e presentas as perdas durante distintos escenarios, non? Aí. É moi interesante ver, porque esas perdas supoño que dependen do grau de exposición ao risco, non? Que teñen, os seus assets que teñen actualmente, non? E basicamente, o que nos vas a contar é que temos moito brown banking, non? Basicamente, no sur de Europa. É unha forma de ler isto, non? Ti afondaches moito nos resultados, poderías elaborar un pouco os motivos de por que crees que isto é así? E tamén queríache preguntar que escenarios ves máis posibles, non? Son dous escenarios bastante distintos, pero o contexto europeo pois parece que é máis acaído ou máis realista, non? O este que se denomina o disorderly transition scenario, non? Que parece que é onde estamos, se especialmente queremos cumplir cos mandatos de Bruselas, non? Mentras que o hothouse world escenario parece un pouquiño o escenario Donald Trump, non? Che quería preguntar eso un pouco, que motiva isto e que escenario pensas que é máis acaído para a realidade europea, especialmente para nós? Gracias.
Moitas gracias, María, pola túa pregunta. Eu penso que o primeiro que hai que resaltar aquí é que estamos falando sempre de o risco de transición climática. Isto quere dicir o risco de experimentar perdas debido á revalorización ou revaluación do valor dos activos financeiros, dependendo dos diferentes escenarios, das diferentes medidas gubernamentais que se poidan impoñer. En este sentido, sí que no sur de Europa hai máis unha exposición, digamos, a constructoras, empresas que son intensivas no uso de enerxía, que podería explicar o feito que no sur de Europa teñamos maiores perdas no escenario de transición desordenada que no escenario de non transición, non? Que sería o caso do hothouse world escenario. Sen embargo, aquí estamos solamente vendo un lado da moeda, porque xustamente, segundo esta gráfica, por exemplo, España, Portugal, estarían obtendo beneficios no escenario de non transición, pero son justamente estes países os que no feito de que non se leve a cabo a transición experimentarían as maiores perdas que virían polos eventos climáticos extremos, pois máis inundacións, máis sequías, e todo isto non o estamos reflexando neste traballo, porque nos estamos simplemente centrando no risco de transición, pero despois está o risco físico que ven polo cambio climático. Entón, isto o mellor pode levar a unha visión sesgada do problema. Por eso, isto simplemente outra medida, outra metodoloxía que se podería engadir a xa amplia ou crecente literatura sobre os riscos climáticos, pero obviamente aquí se está centrando nun problema de valoración de activos e de cambio de valoración de activos, e nós estamos recollendo este potencial cambio a través das dependencias entre os rendementos da renta variable, da bolsa. Pero isto está deixando de lado moitas outras cousas. Entón, é unha ferramenta máis que nos pode axudar a ter unha visión de conxunto. Pero sí, eso é algo a ter en conta, que estas medidas vendas así de lonxe poden levar a engano, porque o que non perdas por un lado podes perdelo polo outro.
é moi interesante o que acabas de comentar porque tú solamente te centras no risco sistemático. E efectivamente o risco de impacto físico é algo que tamén os bancos están a considerar hoxe en día nos seus portafolios e é unha das primeiras cousas que consideran. Non? É tamén interesante ver que na figura do hot house os gañadores e perdedores son un tanto, para a miña sorpresa, non? Eu esperaba unha foto un pouco distinta. Temos un grandísimo produtor de petróleo que hoxe, por exemplo, este ano, onte anunciou que probablemente vai a regalar todo o diñeiro extra multimillonario que acadou este ano, que é Noruega, que gañou, debido á crise actual, máis diñeiro este ano que nos últimos 5 anos. Se está pensando, hai un discurso ético no país superinteresante de se están facendo millonarios a costa das perdas de outros e a costa do sufrimento de outros e consideran que deben doalo de algún xeito. Non? E vexo que ese mesmo país está aquí como un perdedor, cando no meu entender ese país en concreto, un produtor, non? Debería ser un winner. Non sei se tes ti algunha, pero porque se falas de risco sistemático exclusivamente, non? Non sei se miraches máis polo miúdo así a nivel...
Sí, o que pasa no norte de Europa é que, por exemplo, Noruega non é esa gran exportadora de petróleo, pero despois o que obteñen desas vendas está bastante diversificado nese sentido. Despois temos todas as empresas tecnolóxicas do norte de Europa, digamos que se vemos, por exemplo, a composición do índice o MX da Bolsa de Helsinki, está bastante centrado nos sectores máis tecnolóxicos, que son os sectores, digamos, máis disruptivos no tema da transición ecolóxica, na transición hacia unha economía verde, digamos. Entón, eso pode explicar que no feito de que no escenario do Hot House World obteñamos que saen perdendo a pesar das potenciais vendas, porque despois se ves a composición da economía, digamos, non é un sector fundamental sobre o que se base a economía, como podría ser no sur de Europa a construción ou o sector textil ou outros sectores, senón que son economías máis centradas hacia o ámbito tecnolóxico, nese sentido.
Alguén no chat quere preguntar algo? Alguén que este na casa que pode abrir o micro e preguntar directamente? Alguén aquí? Alguén por aquí? Hola, vos. Sí, gustaríame, pregunta aquí alguén. Jorge Pérez Seijo, bo día, gustaríame ter acceso á presentación de Javier Ojea, se pode compartir un enlace ou cargala na web de ECOBAS. Moitas grazas. Non sei se
Sí, absolutamente. Tamén pasarei vos o link na página da comisión onde está o artigo completo, tamén cos apéndices matemáticos, etc.
Estupendo. Pois, efectivamente, moitas grazas, Jorge, xa ves que vai a estar disponible. Alguén máis quere engadir algún comentario, algunha suxestión? Que é super interesante o que nos amosaches con respecto ao tipo de banco que está máis hoxe en día exposto, o que é o risco da transición enerxética, porque é sorprendente ver que grandes bancos europeos, especialmente españois, van a sufrir de forma moi considerable este efecto. Como pensas que os propios inversores están considerando isto e como pensas que os propios bancos están considerando isto, xa para pechar?
Nos centros de estudio dos propios bancos, Santander, BBVA, empezan a crear grupos xustamente para ter en conta os potenciais efectos do cambio climático, montan equipos para medir o risco climático neste sentido. E despois está toda a regulación e toda a normativa que está saindo ESG, na que os bancos acabarán entrando, é dicir, igual que as empresas teñen que declarar como de verde son os rendimentos que están obtendo e as actividades que están realizando. Chegaralles o turno tamén aos bancos de ter que declarar como de verdes son os préstamos que están facendo as empresas, no? Que se chama o Green Asset Ratio, que está iniciándose a introducir en Europa como parte da regulación e como parte de identificar os bancos que están apostando por esta transición e premialos ou castigalos aqueles que non estean facendo o suficiente en comparativa co resto de pares e que se verá reflexado na súa cotización eventualmente.
Bueno, pues sí. Un momentiño que paso o micro.
Sí, en relación a esto que estás a comentar, claro, hay algunas entidades de xestión de fondos que xa están facendo indicacións no sentido de vamos a mirar os reportes non financeiros das empresas, mesmo de bancos, para a hora de diversificar o noso portfolio de investimentos, ter en conta esos indicadores verdes, ¿no? É dicir, incorporémolos. O que pasa é que hai esa dicotomía de, claro, vamos a apostar polo verde, pero ao mesmo tempo, nunha situación como a de agora, pois ter posto cartos en empresas, bueno, do sector do petróleo, por poñer un exemplo, ou calquera outro. Entonces, claro, eso crea unhas dinámicas un pouco extrañas, porque sí, pero non sei como está funcionando o sector financiero. Entendo que ahora mesmo pode haber, nos últimos anos, non tan porque será agora pola guerra, non? Hai certas, como dicilo, discordancias ou contradicións que, bueno, sí, intentan incorporarse, pero non sei hasta que punto iso pode funcionar por sí só ou ten que haber algún estímulo externo vía regulación pública ou os propios consumidores, non? Os propios que poñen cartos nos fondos de investimento. Pero, bueno, normalmente os que poñen cartos nos fondos de investimento o habitual é que miran o rendemento e non miren moito máis a nada. Bueno, non sei. Probablemente non é unha pregunta, non? É un comentario no sentido de que é todo bastante complexo nese sentido.
Sí, un pouco compartindo un pouco este diálogo, agora tamén se está impulsando todo o tema da taxonomía verde, que de alguna maneira busca identificar claramente por uns parámetros científicos obxectivos aquelas actividades que sí contribúen a mitigar o cambio climático, por exemplo, ou sí que loitan co tema das emisións. Entón, nese sentido, está complementando, está dando unha información que ao final sexa coherente respecto a diferentes empresas, que cada un ten a súa forma de reportar esta información non climática. E por outro lado, é certo que igual os rendementos é un factor clave dos inversores, pero o que cabría preguntar aquí é o rendemento a que plazo, non? Porque tamén cando colles un folleto dun fondo de inversión sempre ten en letra moi pequena escrito rendementos pasados non garantizan rendementos futuros, no? Entón, isto é un pouco mesmo, é dicir, ata que punto me interesa engadir factores ambientais na miña inversión? Pois o mellor se invirto no prazo dun ano, 2 anos, 3 anos, non me importa, pero o mellor se eu estou metendo diñeiro para formar o meu fondo de pensións privado, o plazo de 30 anos ou 40 anos, o cambio climático xogue aí un papel fundamental nos rendementos que eu obterei no futuro, no? Entón, eso é un criterio que non é observable ou terá moi pouco peso na decisión do inversor a corto plazo, pero a largo plazo pode ser fundamental.
Non sei se hai alguén máis na audiencia que queira facer outra pregunta, online ou aquí. Nos constaba que unha persoa abrir antes o micro, pero non sabemos se agora sería un bon momento para facer a pregunta. Temos máis? Non. Bueno, pois este tema dá para moitísimo. Javier, moitísimas grazas. Poderíamos estar falando contigo durante moito tempo de distintas cousas. Queríamos te agradecer desde ECOBAS a túa asistencia ao seminario de hoxe, o seminario en si mesmo, que foi moi interesante.